You might be wondering why we didn't look at the resurrection narratives in the Gospels first, and only then proceed to examine resurrection in Paul's letters. The reason is that Paul's letters predate the Gospels, pretty certainly by a matter of a decade or two or three, and Paul's letters show us the type of things Christians were saying about Jesus' resurrection some years before the Easter narratives in the Gospels that we have were composed, at least were written in their final form. In other words, the Gospels were written at a time when the early church, diverse as it was, more or less already had an extant resurrection belief already imprinted upon its faith and theology and witness and praxis. So what we're going to survey now is the origin and credibility of these Easter narratives, as well as the distinctive features of the stories as laid out by the Evangelists. When we think about how the Easter narratives came to originate, as we find them in the Gospels, we have good reason for thinking that they are based on primitive and reliable tradition. First, there's a remarkable lack of scriptural embellishment in the stories, despite the fact that from Paul onwards, people expounded the resurrection with the scriptures to illustrate, to illuminate, to substantiate. It doesn't happen in the Gospels. Second, there are several signs of Jewish authenticity scattered throughout the stories, the tales of burial and so on. Third, the stories reflect a mixture of eyewitness enthusiasm and complete bewilderment. It looks very much as though they reflect not a developed tradition, but the breathless ways in which the tale was told that first day. What's more, the primary witnesses are women, in a world where women's evidence was not legally acceptable. Nobody writing later on, even at the time of Paul, would have made that up. Fourth, we remind ourselves that the word resurrection simply wasn't a word for a hallucination or a vision or a belief that a dead person was now at peace with God. The word resurrection meant bodies. You'd only have used that word if that's what you wanted to say. Fifth, not all Jews believed in resurrection, but for those who did, resurrection was thought to be something that God would do for all of Israel at the end of history. But the disciples claimed that God had done it for Jesus of Nazareth in the middle of history. What made them change the scheme? Clearly, it was their conviction that God really had raised Jesus from the dead. In other words, you can't explain the resurrection stories on the basis that, oh well, Jews believed in resurrection, therefore that's what they said. Sixth, the accounts of the risen Jesus don't fit what we might expect. Some Jewish predictions envisage people returning to life in more or less the same kind of body as before, but Jesus' risen body, though it can talk and walk and eat and be touched, seems to have quite different properties as well. It comes and goes through locked doors. Other Jewish predictions, like Daniel 12 and writings that echo it, envisage the resurrected people shining like stars, but nowhere in the gospel stories does it say that the risen Jesus was shining. In other words, if the stories had been made up on the basis of Jewish expectations, they wouldn't have looked like this. Seventh, the only way you can explain the rise of early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection is with both the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances. Neither makes sense without the other. So when we stand back from the Easter stories, they seem to represent a complex group of narratives, exhibiting a clear Jewish texture, raising various literary and historical questions, pressing a key theological message while indelibly lodged into the historical memory of the early church as the definitive accounts of what they firmly understood to have happened to Jesus. So what can we say about the different resurrection stories in the four Gospels? Let's take them one by one. Mark's resurrection narrative, assuming the secondary nature of the longer endings, we'll talk about that in a moment, ends in a peculiar way in verse 8 of chapter 16, with the women leaving the tomb in confusion, trembling and bewildered. They went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. If this verse does represent the ending of Mark's gospel, at least according to our best textual witnesses, did Mark mean to break off at that point? Did he really intend his whole gospel, admittedly in very rough Greek, to end with this phrase, ephobun togar, for they were afraid? Many questions abound at this point. First, In regard to the longer endings, that is 16:8b and 16:9 to 16, they are unlikely to be authentic, to be what Mark himself wrote. The earliest manuscripts of the Gospels, the great 4th century codices, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, end with 16:8, and they are followed by several later manuscripts, and some of the fathers of the church either show no knowledge of the longer ending, or they show, even while they do reproduce it, that they know it to be dubious. Unfortunately, Mark of all the Gospels is the least well attested in the manuscript tradition, so we have a smaller pool of manuscripts to draw from. But the great 5th century manuscripts, led by the one we call Alexandrinus, include the longer ending, verses 9 to 20, and most subsequent manuscripts follow this lead. Things get more complicated after that, but that's enough on this question for the moment. The best guess is that Mark 16:9 to 16, as we see it in our Bibles, is not a good witness to what Mark himself actually wrote, but it is a good witness to the emergence of a fourfold gospel collection in the second quarter of the 2nd century, since the longer ending was known to Justin Martyr around the middle of the 2nd century. Of course, if Mark 16 verse 8, they said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, is not only the extant ending but the intended ending, what would it mean? Some have claimed that Mark wanted his ending to be deliberately ambiguous, almost parabolic. He was not interested, according to this view, in giving the readers closure. Rather, his readers had to figure out for themselves what the empty tomb and the angelic news would mean. Would they run away in fear like the women, or would they have faith and believe that Jesus was truly risen? Mark gives them the options, but not the answer. Now, that sounds all well and good, tantalizing postmodern reading of Mark's strange ending. I sense it's maybe a bit too clever. I don't think it is what is really going on. Others have taken this ending as a sign that the earliest Christians didn't know about an empty tomb, and Mark has conveniently contrived an explanation for the recent report, recent in his own day, about the empty tomb, as though to say, well, the women were supposed to tell everyone about the empty tomb, but you know what women are like, they're timid and fearful, they chickened out. But, to put it mildly, there are problems here. To begin with, the fact that the women accompanied Jesus to his crucifixion and burial, and they attempted to anoint the body of someone who was thought to be an enemy of the state according to the Sanhedrin, speaks more about their courage than about any cowardice. In addition, that the women said nothing to anyone doesn't mean they failed to inform the disciples of these astonishing events as the angel had commanded them, but only that they kept it a secret from outsiders for reasons of fear. We need to place the fear and silence in verse 8 within the wider pattern of Mark's Gospel, where similar injunctions to silence actually lead to the broadcast of news. For example, when Jesus in Galilee says to somebody who is healed, say nothing to anyone but go and show yourself to the priest, then the person goes and tells everybody about it. If we plot Mark 16:8 as part of the familiar Markan pattern of silence to outsiders, but dissemination of news to another audience, then perhaps we should anticipate something like this. They said nothing to anyone, but they went and told the disciples. Now, we can't confirm that possibility except to say that in Mark, often moments of fear become moments of opportunity for expressing faith and for engaging in action. So too for the women at the tomb, despite their fear and bewilderment, we might naturally expect that their next move would be to find their feet and their faith and go off to the disciples and tell them the good news. And that is exactly how Matthew interprets what Mark has written, as Matthew says that although the women were scared, they were filled with joy and ran to tell the disciples. Another option is that Mark 16:8 isn't where Mark intended the gospel to end, and that he did in fact pen a longer ending which is now lost. This happens, by the way, to many documents in antiquity. If you go and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you'll see that many of them lack the beginning and the end, because when they're held on a scroll with two sticks, one at either end, it's the beginning and end that tend to get torn off with time. It's quite possible that that happened with Mark's Gospel. We've just seen that a more expansive ending, where the women said nothing to anyone, but then told the disciples, would fit naturally into the Markan secrecy motif and the pattern of fear and faith that Mark has constructed throughout his gospel. In addition, there are three other observations which hint in this direction. First, the Markan Passion predictions look forward to Jesus' resurrection as the sequel to his suffering. He says the Son of Man is going to be killed, and on the third day he'll be raised. And also they look forward to a proclamation of the gospel further abroad. And second, the angel's news that he has risen, Mark 16:6, naturally leads to the expectation of appearances of the risen Jesus. And third, in Mark 16:7, it implies that the coming restoration of Simon Peter is going to happen, rather like what we find in John 21, and that there'll be an appearance in Galilee, rather like what we find in Matthew 28. So Mark's gospel, in its extant form, ends on the notes of fear and trembling, but I think probably contained additional text about the Son of Man being raised from the dead, appearing to the disciples as a further proof of Jesus as the divinely sent prophet who opposed the Jerusalem temple and has now been vindicated. That ending, somewhere and somehow, is now lost to us, and so Mark remains a bit of an enigma. What about Matthew? Matthew goes his own way and, for us, poses his own problems. He has two stories which mark him out from the other Gospels: sleeping saints walking out of their tombs, and a guard of soldiers who get bribed to spread rumors. And in the middle of all this, we have a story of the finding of the empty tomb, quite similar to Mark's story, though with significant differences. Matthew's narrative then concludes with a final commissioning on a mountain in Galilee. First, concurrent with the veil of the temple being torn in two as Jesus is crucified, Matthew says, "The earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs broke open, the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people." This is, to say the least, a strange story, not mentioned elsewhere in the Gospels, certainly not outside of the Gospels. The problem is that the passage is so strange, with dead saints coming to life when Jesus dies, but not coming out of the tomb until after Jesus' resurrection. One could say that some stories are so odd that they may just have happened, and this might be one of them, but in historical terms, there's no way of finding out. Alternatively, as the scholar Michael Licona has suggested, perhaps Matthew is here drawing on some apocalyptic special effects and using portents of darkness and resurrections as a proof to say that a great king has died, or that in some sense the day of the Lord has come. Or perhaps Matthew is blending together the present and the future, rather like some icons in the Greek Orthodox Church, where they see Jesus being raised and also Jesus raising Adam and Eve and the whole human race, a kind of eschatological mélange, with Matthew previewing the future resurrection and underscoring the life-giving power of Jesus' death. Second, there's another story which spills over from Matthew's passion sequence. This is the vignette where the Pharisees request that Pilate should place an additional guard on Jesus' tomb to stop the disciples stealing the body. But then when the resurrection happens, the guards fold like a card table. Jesus' body does vacate the tomb, and the chief priests and elders then scramble to bribe the soldiers and tell them to circulate the rumor that the disciples had come by night and stolen Jesus' body. This story obviously is part of an apologia for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. It's an attempt to ward off any suggestion that the disciples had in fact stolen the body, which must have seemed the most natural explanation for the emptiness of the tomb. What we should bear in mind is how implausible it is to suppose that that whole story would have been invented in the first place, let alone told and finally written down, unless there was already a rumor going around that the disciples had indeed stolen the body. If nobody had suggested such a thing, it's difficult to imagine the Christians putting that idea into people's heads by making up tales that said they had. So it's no surprise then that Justin Martyr reports that the story was still being told by anti-Christian Jewish apologists in the mid-2nd century. Furthermore, a charge such as this would never have arisen unless it was already well known that there was an empty tomb and or a missing body, all of which would require an explanation. So if the empty tomb were itself a late legend, it's unlikely that people would have spread stories about body stealing, and hence that Christians would have employed the dangerous tactic of reporting such stories in order to refute them. Third, Matthew's final scene, verses 16 to 20 of his chapter 28, is highly significant as it condenses so many Matthean themes. The main emphasis of this closing scene is on who Jesus is now revealed to be. He is the one who has been granted all authority in heaven and on earth, virtually identical in phraseology to the kingdom clause in Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." This, it seems, is how the prayer is being answered. This, in other words, is how the kingdom is being launched at last, how the will of the Father is to be done. The significance of the resurrection, then, as far as Matthew is concerned, is that Jesus now has the role that had been marked out for the Messiah in Psalms 2 and 72 and 89, which became concentrated in such image-laden figures as the Son of Man in Daniel 7, and the texts which developed that line of thought. We might also instance Psalm 8, already quoted more than once in the Gospel, about the Son of Man who has authority upon earth. The worldwide commission that Jesus then gives the disciples depends directly upon his already possessing all authority in heaven and on earth, within the kingdom that is now well and truly inaugurated. And the only explanation for this messianic authority on the one hand and this kingdom fulfillment on the other is that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Matthew has written through and through a book of Jewish history and theology. His whole thesis is that Israel's God has been at work in Jesus. Jesus is the Emmanuel, the God with us, a point proved climactically and decisively by his resurrection. Matthew believed every bit as much as did Paul that Jesus really did rise from the dead, leaving an empty tomb behind him, and that he was now invested with all authority in heaven and on earth. So we move to Luke. Luke 24, the last chapter of his gospel, is a small masterpiece. It's designed as the closing scene for a large-scale work of art. Whether or not, as tradition fancifully has suggested, the author of the third gospel was himself an artist, a painter, his skill in sketching verbal pictures is unmatched in the New Testament, and his resurrection chapter displays this skill in full measure. Luke 24 has 3 sections and a final conclusion. First, there is the story of the empty tomb, largely following Mark and Matthew. Then second, from verse 13 onwards, there is the journey to Emmaus and the brief nearly meal on arrival. Jesus breaks the bread but doesn't stay for the rest of the meal. And then thirdly, there is the sequence of the appearances of Jesus to the disciples in the upper room, verses 36 to 49, and finally the last 4 verses describe the ascension and round off the gospel as a whole, simultaneously overlapping with the opening scene in Acts. Like the other evangelists, Luke is telling the Easter stories in his own way. He feels himself free to shape them and to point up particular lessons, which are fairly obvious since he repeats them in each section of the chapter. Luke has followed Mark in many ways throughout his gospel, but he cheerfully departs from him here, with no mention of the disciples being told to go to Galilee, and no hint of resurrection appearances anywhere other than in and around Jerusalem. Luke names 3 women as the early visitors to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, but he also speaks of the others with them in verse 10. There is no mention of the women seeing Jesus as they do in Matthew, and as Mary Magdalene does in John. The women fulfill their commission to tell the disciples, but, he says, their words seemed to them, to the disciples, an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. Most noticeably, perhaps, among incidental features of this chapter, the entire sequence of resurrection appearances, culminating in the ascension itself, appears to take place on a single day. Luke also has unique material and refers to a resurrection appearance to Peter in verse 34, providing a particular emphasis on the physicality of Jesus' resurrection body, as he breaks the bread and then as he eats broiled fish. And the Emmaus story is the central vehicle through which Luke wants to convey his message about Easter and its meaning. Across that whole narrative, Luke highlights two features: the fresh exposition of Scripture and the breaking of the bread. The hearts of the two on the road are burning within them at the first, Scripture, and their eyes are opened at the second, the breaking of the bread. And then in the upper room, Jesus opened the minds of the disciples to understand the Scriptures. When we bring all this forward into Acts, we find two of the four elements that Luke mentions of early church life. He says they continued in the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. What Luke's whole work is designed to do at a large scale is to tell the story of Jesus and the early church in such a way that its position at the climax of Israel's scriptural story can be fully understood and appropriated. Disciples are to understand the Scriptures in a whole new way in the light of the events that have happened to Jesus. And then they are to make this fresh reading of Scripture the source of their inner life of burning zeal and their framework for understanding who Jesus was and is, who they are in relation to him, and what they must do as a result. And all of that is focused for Luke on this meal, this bread breaking, in which Jesus is mysteriously recognized. John's two Easter chapters, chapters 20 and 21, rank with Romans 8 as among the most glorious pieces of writing on the resurrection. John doesn't have the rigorous logic of Paul's "therefore" at the end of a long and gritty argument. John is telling a story, not constructing a logical argument. John's Easter narrative is comparatively more dramatic and more laden with symbolism than the synoptic accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John provides a breathtaking synthesis of theological testimony, of early tradition, of apostolic memory, and vibrant metaphor that is unmatched elsewhere in the New Testament. John's Gospel ends with newfound faith, but it is faith that must now go out into a new world. John emphasizes in verse 1 and in verse 19 of his chapter 20 that this is happening on the first day of the week. For John, this is all about new creation. The faith of the disciples is, for John, a risky resurrection faith. It rises to face a new day, and it's challenged to attempt new tasks without knowing in advance where it'll all lead. We have that sense of bewilderment of the disciples going out into a strange, unmapped new world. The basic features of John's Easter story are easily laid out. There's the initial story of the finding of the empty tomb, the first 18 verses, and that overlaps in content with that of the synoptics, but it's the differences that stand out. Mary Magdalene is mentioned alone among the women, and she meets Jesus, as the women do in Matthew. And as in Luke 24, Peter runs to the tomb on hearing the news, but in John's Gospel, he's accompanied by the beloved disciple. And in a dramatic scene, they run together, with the beloved disciple getting to the tomb first, but Peter then blundering on ahead and going into the tomb. Next, there follow two stories set in the evening in the upper room. The first on the same day as the events in the garden, and the second a week later. The first of these, in verses 19 to 23, seems to correspond in content, though not in wording, with Luke 24, verses 36 to 49. Jesus commissions his followers for a mission to the world, and he bestows the Spirit on them to equip them for this task. The second then presents a scene which artists ancient and modern have loved. Thomas, who was not present on the first evening, acquires his now perpetual nickname by declaring his doubt that the Lord had truly risen, and he is then confronted by the risen Jesus, inviting him to touch and see for himself. Thomas seems to refuse the invitation and comes out instead with the fullest confession of faith anywhere in the whole gospel, "My Lord and my God." Jesus makes a wry comment. "Have you believed because you've seen me? It'd be much better and more blessed if you believed without seeing." And then the scene is over. And so too, it seems, is the book in its original form. But it's not the end of John as we now have it. John 21, which appears like an appendix, provides more appearance stories, this time set in Galilee. And John, just like Matthew, has Jesus appear in both Jerusalem and Galilee, though the appearances are far fuller, and the Galilee appearance is by the lake shore, not on the mountain. Peter and 6 others of the disciples go fishing and catch nothing. Jesus, unrecognized, directs operations from the shore, as once before in Luke's Gospel, resulting again in a spectacular catch. Coming ashore, the disciples find Jesus already cooking breakfast and inviting them to share it. The author comments in a haunting aside, "None of them dared ask him, 'Who are you?' because they knew it was the Lord." This is what I meant before when I spoke of the transformation of Jesus' body. These were his friends, his constant companions, but they were still puzzled. There was something different. They still wanted to ask. He had been transformed. Jesus then takes Simon Peter for a walk along the shore, and he asks him 3 times if he loves him, corresponding to Peter's triple denial in John 18. Peter's reply, though, is only halfway there. Jesus asks for agape love. "Simon, son of John, agapes me." But Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I'm your friend, su oides hoti philo se." And then the 3rd time, to Peter's dismay, Jesus asks the question in Peter's word, "Are you really my friend? Philis me." Jesus, I think, is saying to Peter, "Okay, Peter, if that's where you are, that's where we'll start." And so Jesus then commissions Peter to be a kind of under-shepherd, which will require Peter too to face suffering. And then, seeing the beloved disciple following them, they have their brief exchange about him, which leads to the open-ended challenge, which I think for John is the challenge of the resurrection itself. What is that to you? You must follow me. And that leads straight into the ending, which we already noted. Some scholars have been quick to treat John's Gospel as focused more or less on what we call realized eschatology, the idea that eternal life is a present reality rather than a future state. And this seems to be helped by Jesus' claim in John 11 that "I am the resurrection and the life," the raising of Lazarus, the repeated references to eternal life as a present possession of some sort, and how Jesus experiences and reveals the divine glory even in his passion. But John's text itself is more subtle than this over-realized eschatology actually takes seriously. For a start, there is a resilient future perspective in John's Gospel that looks ahead to a future day of judgment and resurrection. Undoubtedly, John does see crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension as, in a sense, a single event. That makes good sense at one level theologically, but he can also differentiate them. Jesus, in the resurrection story, says to Mary, "Don't touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." There's a distinction between resurrection and ascension. And for John, the future horizon is not glibly telescoped into the present. The mere fact of writing resurrection narratives as substantial as these speaks for itself when it comes to the distinction between crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. John's Gospel then is supremely a gospel of witness with its testimony to Jesus' resurrection and the constellation of meaning and mission that it generates. It matters for John that Easter actually happened, precisely because he is an incarnational theologian, committed to recognizing and helping others to recognize the living God in the human flesh of Jesus. It is vital and non-negotiable for him that when Thomas makes his famous confession in John 20:28, that he should be looking at the living God in human form, not simply with the eye of faith, but with real ordinary human sight, which could be backed up by ordinary human touch, although it seems Thomas remained content with sight on that occasion. And similarly, The 153 fish that Simon Peter dragged up on the shore in chapter 21 is certainly symbolic for something, though people have debated endlessly what it is a symbol of. But the man who was cooking breakfast for the disciples on the shore was a living person, Jesus, not an allegory of faith. And the evangelist John reiterates the point that by saying that this was the third time Jesus had appeared to the disciples after being raised from the dead. In other words, there is nothing about John 20 and 21 seen in the context of the gospel as a whole, and particularly of the prologue, "In the beginning was the Word," which it balances so well, nothing to suggest that these stories originated as, or would have been heard by their first hearers as, allegory or metaphor of spiritual experience in the sense of non-historical, non-bodily experience. John believes that the Word was made flesh, and that that flesh was crucified, and that Jesus then rose again on the third day. This historical datum that we now have before us, it's a widely held, consistently shaped and highly influential belief that Jesus of Nazareth was bodily raised from the dead. This belief was held by virtually all the early Christians for whom we have evidence. It was at the center of their characteristic praxis, narrative, symbol, and belief. It was the basis of their recognition of Jesus as Messiah and Lord, their insistence that the Creator God had inaugurated the long-awaited new age, and above all, their hope for their own future bodily resurrection within the ultimate new creation. Jesus' resurrection is, of course, more than mere historical probability. It also generates a world of meaning. First, it tells us something about Jesus himself. The resurrection constitutes Jesus as the world's true sovereign, the Son of God who claims absolute allegiance from everyone and everything within creation. Jesus is the one in whom the living God, Israel's God, has become personally present in the world, has become one of the human creatures that were made from the beginning in the image of the same God. He is the start of the Creator's new world. He is its pilot project, indeed, its pilot. Second, faith in the resurrection is not a mere affirmation of a creedal proposition. It is a self-involving statement, meaning trust in God, in this God, the God who raises the dead, the God who calls for a commitment to discipleship and to the worldwide mission that the resurrection has launched. Resurrection faith calls people to new tasks, embodying Jesus' kingdom praxis, belonging to the renewed covenant family, proclaiming Jesus as Lord and Savior. So, as in Luke's story, for Christians, the road to Emmaus is not just a story, it's a way of life. Third, resurrection generates a countercultural perspective. The new age has begun. No wonder the Herods and the Caesars and the Sadducees of this world, ancient and modern, were and are eager to rule out all possibility of actual resurrection. They are, after all, staking a counterclaim on the real world. It is the real world that the tyrants and bullies, including intellectual and cultural tyrants and bullies, try to rule by force, only to discover that in order to do so, they have to quash all rumors of resurrection, rumors that would imply that their greatest weapons, death and destruction, are not, after all, omnipotent. But it is the real world in Jewish thinking that the real God made and still grieves over. It is the real world that, in the earliest stories of Jesus' resurrection, was decisively and forever reclaimed by that event, an event which demands to be understood not as a bizarre miracle, a one-off, God did this strange thing just as a special favor for Jesus. No, this was the beginning of new creation. It is the real world that, however complex this may become, historians are committed to studying. And however dangerous this may turn out to be, it is the real world in and for which Christians are committed to living and, where necessary, dying. Nothing less is demanded by the God of creation, the God of justice, the God revealed in and as the crucified and risen, Jesus of Nazareth.
I'm here in the apartment where the Apostle Paul may well have been under house arrest in Rome. And the way I imagine Paul being here is contemplating his fate, contemplating the future, the resurrection from the dead. But how reasonable is that belief? Is there any evidence for Jesus' resurrection? Now, obviously, we can't prove the resurrection with any kind of certainty. But I'm convinced that if you weigh up all the evidence, if you look at all the factors and all the witnesses, the logic of history is that Jesus indeed arose from the dead. And I think there's three main lines of argument. First of all, Jesus' tomb was found empty. I think it's necessarily implied by what the Apostle Paul writes in the opening of 1 Corinthians 15, where he says that Jesus was buried and he arose from the dead on the third day. Going from buried to raised implies an empty tomb. We also find the stories of the empty tomb in the Gospels. In particular, Mark offers what sounds and smells like very fresh and early Jewish tradition, the way it describes Jesus as the Nazarene, the women on the way to prepare his body, getting ready for the Sabbath, and that sort of thing. The other thing we could add on that is that the first witnesses to the empty tomb were women. Now, in the ancient world, women's testimony was largely legally worthless. And if you're going to fabricate the story of the empty tomb, why invoke women whose witness would not stand up under a forensic examination? The other thing we can say about the empty tomb is one of the first polemical responses we find against it by the Jewish contemporaries of the early church is that the disciples must have stolen the body. But that very claim actually presupposes that the body was not in the tomb. If anyone knew where the body was, they certainly would have produced it. The most likely explanation then has to be that the tomb was empty and nobody knew where the body was. Secondly, there are the resurrection appearances themselves. We know that on multiple occasions, Jesus appeared to solitary individuals, to people walking on the road to Emmaus, to doubters, to skeptics, to unbelievers, and at one place, even to 500 people all at once. And if you look at the way these appearances are described, it's with a kind of excited bewilderment. It's kind of like, I know this is strange, I know this kind of thing doesn't happen all the time, but it really did happen. And the other thing we have to remember is that they could have said so many other things about Jesus. If they believed that Jesus had come back to life or has survived or his movement carried on, they could have said, well, he became an angel or he ascended into heaven and became a star. Or they could say he's now in the bosom of Abraham. But the early church very carefully, very deliberately used the language of resurrection to describe what had happened to Jesus. Now, that made what was a very difficult and horrific week even messier, because resurrection was a physical raising, and it was meant to happen for all of Israel at the end of history, and yet they were saying that one man, Jesus, had been raised in the middle of history. And despite of how confusing it might be, how much it might require rethinking Jewish hopes for the future, that's what they maintained. They saw Jesus physically, and they saw him alive. Now, we have to remember as well that the empty tomb by itself, I don't think would have generated belief in the resurrection. Even the appearances of Jesus alive would not have led people to think, let's use the word resurrection. It's the empty tomb and the appearances together that generate this belief that Jesus was raised in a physical, glorified body. Finally, the third thing we have to mention is that the whole church was driven by this belief that Christ had been raised. It wasn't an ancillary belief that they added on. It wasn't simply an accessory. They were a resurrection movement, and their preaching, their prayers, their hopes, their dreams of the future, their symbols, what they did and what they said was all permeated by the belief that Christ was risen. The best explanation for what provides the momentum, the energy, and the impetus for the early church has to be that Christ indeed was risen. If we had to sum up what the resurrection meant for the first Christians, and to put it on a short phrase we could fit on a bumper sticker, what would that slogan be? What would you pick?
I think I would say new creation has begun with Jesus. Because you see, for many Christians today, the resurrection of Jesus means there is a life after death, or we're going to heaven someday, or something like that. But for the writers of the Gospels and for Paul, the way they tell the story, they're saying new creation has begun. That is the thing that God promised in the Psalms and Isaiah and so on, that he was going to do for the whole creation. He has done for Jesus. And that means that Jesus is now the agent of the new creation, which through his followers in the power of the Spirit goes out into all the world. So new creation has begun with Jesus. And that means that one day God is going to do for the whole creation what he did for Jesus at the first Easter, and that we, his people, in the power of the Spirit, will be raised to share in that work. So that's the message. New creation has begun with Jesus.